Welcome back everyone. Today we continue with the next part of this series called What If Future Gohan Was Never Killed by the Androids. Let's aim for 350 likes on this one. Also, don't forget to leave a comment letting me know if you've enjoyed the series so far. With that, let's begin. The grieving Saiyan turned his head and stared, horrified, as Frieza approached him with a large smile on his face. "Hello little monkey, your day been good?" The tyrant came to a stop as he stared over the bloody body of Trunks. "Well, I guess not." He placed a finger to his chin and pretended to study Trunks' dead body, the smile still bright on his face as he said, "You know Daddy, I think something is missing from that little fellow." "Oh really?" King Cold gave an exaggerated look of surprise. Whatever could that be? Gohan remained silent as they spoke. Nothing could bring him out of his daze. His little brother was dead. What else could possibly matter? "I think I know." A slightly deeper voice made itself known behind Gohan. Frieza's evil smile widened as he looked past the kneeling Saiyan. "Oh, Cooler, you've always been good at finding things, haven't you?" Gohan turned his head so that he could see Cooler's form emerge from the darkness of the night. Cooler had the same smirk that Frieza wore as he walked towards Gohan, hiding something behind his back. "Hello monkey, I think I've found a little something for your friend here," Cooler said with a chilling grin. Slowly, he pulled out the object hidden behind his back, revealing it to be the bloody head of Trunks. Gohan could only stare in horror as Cooler laughed and callously dropped it on the ground before kicking it roughly towards him. The head rolled several times before coming to a stop next to Gohan's knee. Gohan stared at Trunks' head, and strangely enough, it seemed to be staring back at him. Trunks' dead eyes were locked onto Gohan's. Trunks' lips parted, and Gohan gasped as he heard a voice. Why did you let them do it?" Tears streamed down Gohan's face like waterfalls. I didn't want." Trunks' speech became slurred as he continued. "Why did you let me die?" Gohan stuttered, his voice barely a whisper. Trunks' words became increasingly garbled. "Why did you let us die?" Gohan was choking on his words, unable to form a coherent sentence. I didn't want, I tried." Then, Trunks fell silent. "Oh, so you tried." Frieza laughed, kneeling down next to Gohan's left side. "Well, now your friends are all dead for your trying." Gohan didn't respond. He continued to stare at Trunks' head, his mind a whirl of guilt and despair. Frieza began to examine him. "You know Daddy, I still think something's wrong." "Oh?" King Cold was visibly amused. "What is that, son?" Cooler stepped up next to Gohan's other side and said, "I concur, something's still wrong." Gohan barely murmured, "You're all dead, my dad killed you." "Yes brother, but I can't seem to figure out what it is." Frieza ignored Gohan's comment and continued to scrutinize him. "Well," King Cold chirped in, "my memory may be foggy, but didn't he used to only have one arm?" Frieza laughed and nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, how right you are, father." He placed his hand on Gohan's shoulder and poked the limp arm attached to it. "This isn't supposed to be here." Rather than pull his arm free from Frieza's grip, which he desperately wanted to do, Gohan turned his head and glared into Frieza's eyes. "You are dead, you and your brother and father. My dad made sure of that." Frieza's smile twisted into a vicious snarl. "Oh, I'm dead, am I?" he spat, lifting Gohan's arm horizontally. "Then how am I able to do this?" Gohan felt Frieza's grip tighten on his arm. He knew what was about to happen, but for some reason, his body chose to do nothing to stop it. The half-sen knew he could easily pull his arm away from Frieza and, if he wanted to, probably kill him with a quick and powerful punch through the stomach. But he didn't. A horrible scream escaped Gohan's mouth as Frieza began to tear the limb away from his shoulder. Gohan was feeling a pain beyond pain, but it was as though he felt nothing at all. His body remained numb as a sense of urgency ran through his nerves to his brain, screaming at him to pull back to take back his newly found arm. But nothing could make him do what he didn't want. Trunks was dead, and it was his fault. He had failed his little brother, and for that, he needed to be punished. Gohan gasped staggered breaths as he attempted to recompose himself. The tearing sound had ceased, and once again he felt the absence that he had gotten so used to over the months. "Oh look Daddy." Frieza swung the bloody limb around his head like a helicopter, splattering the ground and Gohan with the liquid crimson. "It's like a loose bat." The tyrant lowered the arm and smashed the end of it across Gohan's face. The Sen fell over from the impact and laid flat on the ground as blood poured from his stump, coating the ground with the dark color of red. King Cold spoke very sharply. "Son, careful with that. It's getting all over the place." He moved his hands in front of his face, trying to block the splatter. "Oh come Daddy. You have to enjoy the little things." Frieza laughed as he dropped the arm and walked over to his father, Cooler following behind him. A small drop of blood had landed on Cold's armor, The Ice Jin sighed as he attempted to wipe it off with his finger. Your mother is always furious when she sees blood on my armor. Cooler chuckled and shook his head as he spoke. You can change on the ship, father. King Cold nodded before saying, yes, but I take no pleasure in wasting royal armor. He turned around and began to walk off. Let us go. There's nothing left to do here. Cooler turned and fell in step with his father. Frieza started to follow but paused as he heard Gohan's desperate gasps for air. Oh, I almost forgot. Frieza turned and pointed his index finger at Gohan's bloody form. A small purple light began to flash around the extended finger. That you're still alive. But, Gohan struggled to get the words out as the world began to fade to black. You're all dead. The Saiyan's eyes began to close as he heard Frieza laugh and say, fool, no one could ever kill the Cold family. Gohan's eyes opened in a flash, his pupils dark beads in a sea of white. The half-sen took a few large breaths before allowing a long sigh of relief. He rested in his bed comfortably before noticing the sharp pain in his leg, followed by the slightly less painful throb of his broken ribs. He groaned as the hurt washed over him and allowed his head to sink further into his pillow. Well, that was one horrible dream, he muttered to himself. It was often that Gohan had nightmares. Usually, it was the only thing he received whenever he went to sleep due to the decade of fights all ending in him being beaten to near death. His nightmares never ran out of fuel. Why did I dream of Frieza? Gohan's nightmares of Frieza had started shortly after he had returned to Namek and had ended little more than a year later. The last time the tyrant had even crossed his mind was nearly 2 years ago when Bulma made a Namek joke about how ripped their dragon was compared to Earth's. Gohan cringed as he shifted onto his side, facing the door. He looked downward toward the small bookshelf sitting next to the foot of his bed. He scanned the filled shelves until his eyes came to rest on a smallish red book cramped between two large black titles. He began to formulate a plan of how to reach the book when the events of the day before rushed back into his mind. He remembered the vicious fight, the death of Android 17, and how beaten Trunks had looked as he crumpled into the sand. Is he okay? He exclaimed, panicking. He reached underneath the covers to find the phone in his pants but suddenly realized that he was no longer wearing them. He was semi-freaked out until he felt the splint attached to his broken leg. Oh, I get it. The young man relaxed slightly. They had to take them off to put the splint on. He turned his face to the wooden door and began to think, how am I going to get over there? Several seconds passed before Gohan started to get an idea of how to get the door open. It swung outward from the room, and the lock was somewhat broken. Anytime he'd even lean on the thing, it would open. Gohan raised his hand and allowed a very small ball of light to build. Okay, easy now, he muttered to himself. He fired the blast and watched as it charged hard into the wood frame, causing the door to swing open fast. The person standing on the other end released a sharp cry as the door slammed into their face. Gohan cringed as he heard the thump followed by, ow. Sorry, he immediately shouted. Didn't know you were there. Sheesh. Trunks stepped out from behind the door, rubbing his forehead. I went all the way to the tower to get you these, and this is the thanks I get? The boy revealed a very small brown pouch, which Gohan knew carried senzu beans. Gohan smiled at his friend. Glad to see you, buddy. I thought for a second you might not have made it. Trunks made an exaggerated face of shock. Seriously? You and I both know I'm like a mega tank when it comes to fights. Gohan shook his head, the smile still warmly glued to his face as he said, Trunk, good job. Trunks cocked his head slightly before saying, what? Gohan allowed a happy sigh to escape his lips. You did great out there against the androids. Because of you, there's only one of those monsters out there now. Trunks rubbed the back of his head, a habit he had picked up from Gohan. Well, I didn't do all that much. I mean, you're the one that killed him. A modest smile spread across his face. Gohan responded lightly, give yourself a little credit. If you hadn't held him down, who knows if I would have hit him. And if you hadn't cut his arm, well, let's just say it's that injury that allowed me to beat him, even if you didn't exactly listen to me. Gohan grumbled the last part. Trunks stared at him with an open mouth. Are you serious? You're mad at me? I sure am. You should have run away from the androids, not fought them. The smile on Gohan's face had vanished. Trunks shoved his hand into his face. I can't believe this. He looked up and glared into Gohan's eyes. I help you destroy one of those monsters, and you get mad at me. You should have listened to my instructions like you said you would. Gohan kept his voice low but stern, his eyes serious. Trunks mimicked Gohan's tone as he spoke. You said it yourself. If I hadn't disobeyed you, then you wouldn't have been able to kill 17. Gohan took a moment to think of a response before saying, that's not entirely true. There's no way to tell if I wouldn't have been able to beat the androids without your help. Trunks snapped, without my help, you'd be dead right now. Gohan stared at his younger friend with wide eyes. It wasn't often that Trunks lost his temper like that. The lavender-haired boy took a breath before saying, They were going to kill you, Gohan. They said it before you arrived. They were gonna ambush you and take you out. Gohan lowered his gaze slightly, a small smile creeping up onto his face. Alright, Trunks, you win. Trunks' eyebrows scrunched up. What? Gohan's smile widened. You were trying to save my life. All I can be is grateful. Thank you, Trunks. You're not mad at me anymore? Trunks tilted his head. Not at all. You did what you thought was right, and I have my life because of it. Thanks, Trunks. In truth, Gohan was still mad at Trunks, but he didn't want to start the day off grumpy, so he let it go. He would find some other way to pester the kid about it later. No problem. There was a long pause before Trunks shouted, "Oh, that reminds me. Mom said she's working on an arm for you." Oh really? Gohan tried to sit up but failed. Oof, so you guys found Frieza's arm while I was out? Trunks shook his head. Nah, the arm was a bust, but the guys who brought us in also brought in 17's corpse, so Mom said she could examine his arm and make a copy for you. Gohan groaned as he tried to adjust himself in his bed. It was becoming uncomfortable on his side. Not feeling too good, Captain. Trunks grinned. Gohan chuckled and said, "Toss me a senzu." Trunks looked down at the pouch in his hand. Well, I don't know. Gohan gave him a serious look. Trunks, give me a senzu. Trunks looked back out into the hallway that ran perpendicular to Gohan's room, a bright smile washing over his face as something seemed to catch his eye towards the living room. Alright, here you go, Gohan. The grinning boy pulled out one of the magical green beans and tossed it into Gohan's open hand. Trunks happily shouted, "See ya," before dashing back out into the hallway, accidentally slamming the door in the process. Gohan stared at the bean for a long time before plopping it into his mouth and chomping down on it. He felt a pang of guilt every time he had to use one. Korin had told him the process of obtaining the senzu beans, and it was no easy task. The senzu tree would only produce the beans if the purest of waters were used on it. Those waters were unfortunately located several miles from the old cat's tower. Since Korin could fly, it didn't used to take him too long, but since the androids, it had become even more dangerous to leave the tower. Gohan had offered to retrieve the sacred waters before, but the wise cat had said only he could know of the sacred pool's location, and therefore only he could retrieve them. It was always a strange feeling whenever Gohan ate a senzu bean. The sensation of bones popping back into place and mending in seconds was very unnerving, and the sudden burst of energy shot through his chest as if it were saying, "Get your butt moving." Gohan stood from his bed and took several seconds to stretch, the feeling making him groan slightly. It felt like centuries had gone by in the day that he'd been out. He carefully removed the splint and set it aside before walking over to his dingy dresser. Even though Bulma had protested, Gohan had decided to keep his old dresser, along with several other things from when he was a boy. The desk he had was still the same, even if it was a decade out of date. The bookshelf from his younger years was starting to fall apart, but whenever one of the shelves would collapse, Gohan would always repair it instead of replace it. The long mirror he had placed next to his desk was a gift from his mother before she had passed. The doctors said that she died from natural causes, but Gohan knew that was a lie. She had died from heartbreak, from the death of her son. Of course, Gohan never really died, but his future did. After the sad death of Goku, Chi-Chi barely had enough time to grieve before the androids poked their nasty heads out of hell. Once the Z-fighters were killed, it fell on Gohan to defend the world, completely destroying any future he would have had. This is what killed Gohan inside, and then slowly Chi-Chi. Once Gohan had started venturing off to defeat the androids, always returning beaten to near death, something began to slip away from the two. Chi-Chi began to realize that she and her son would never have a peaceful life, that a new monster would always take the place of the last. This thought ate her alive, knowing that there was no point in saving the Earth again simply because it would always be shoved back into danger. To know that her darling Gohan, a protege, a little boy genius, would always be fighting for his life instead of fulfilling his dreams. What type of future is that? Gohan had lost his hope in a slightly different manner. He had seen Chi-Chi's point of view far before she had, and knew that he would no longer have the future he would have enjoyed. Gohan merely accepted the fact and moved on. What truly scared him was the snowball effect that had occurred so far. A year before, he had noticed that every threat to Earth had been greater than the last, and a threat always came, meaning there was a threat coming that was even more powerful than the androids, and that terrified him. How would he defeat something that trumped the androids? What could he possibly do to save the Earth once a power like that came? He wouldn't. He'd become useless, and the Earth would be destroyed. All because he was too weak. Stop. Gohan shook his head and his thoughts began to dissipate. You are not too weak. You finally killed 17 in the last battle, and soon you will do the same to 18. You will be strong enough to protect the Earth when the time comes. You've protected it this long. Another voice entered his brain as he consoled himself. You've done a pretty crappy job. Gohan sighed as the thought popped into his head because he hadn't done a great job. Most of the human race had been killed, and all but a few cities had been destroyed. A world that once flourished with life and happiness now cowered in fear underneath the few metaphorical rocks that were left. Father would have done a better job, Gohan muttered to himself. He didn't quite understand why, but he felt that if Goku hadn't been killed by the virus, somehow everything would be okay right now. He knew that Goku's power paled in comparison to the androids, but if Goku had lived, would things be better? Gohan's thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock on the door followed by, "What are you doing in there? Are you coming out anytime soon?" Gohan could hear the annoyance in Bulma's voice. He merely chuckled and said, "I'll be out in a sec." Listening as her light footsteps echoed down the hall, bouncing off the marble flooring, he turned back to his dresser and pulled out a black tank top and some gray sweatpants. He had very little trouble getting changed before walking over to the door where he paused, sensing something. Why do I sense so many? Beyond the door and down the hallway, he could feel an army of Kai's signatures, all very low, around the average human, but Gohan knew not to judge based on power alone. They seemed to be grouped up in the living room, and based on how quiet it was, they were hiding. Gohan's eyes widened as he realized that he felt Bulma's and Trunks' ki in that mass. Terror filled his body as he began to remember the dream. Gohan swung the door open fast and rushed out. He immediately noticed that all the lights were off, making the hallway pitch black. He moved to the switch in an instant and flicked it on and off with no response. They cut the power. He charged a bright yellow ki blast in his hand. The ball of energy gave the effect of a torch with just barely enough light to see a few feet ahead. He began to sprint towards the living room, taking only seconds to close the distance, and released a startled "Gah!" as the lights flickered on. The entire room, filled with people, shouted with excitement. Surprise! Gohan merely stood there with his mouth slightly ajar as he took in his surroundings. The walls were littered with cheery decorations, multicolored balloons stuck to the ceiling, and upbeat music began to play. Gohan looked over the huge number of people filling the tiny space and realized that each and every one of them was smiling at him. Bulma emerged from the crowd and patted him on the back. "So, what do you think?" Gohan stared at her, a dumb look across his face as he murmured, "Why, wah." Trunks floated out above the crowd and shouted with a smile, "You didn't think we'd forget your birthday, did you?" "My birthday?" Gohan blinked, his mind struggling to process the shift from panic to celebration. "My birthday," he repeated, almost in disbelief. Bulma nodded, grinning. "That's right. We thought you could use a break, Gohan. You've done so much for us. You deserve a celebration." Gohan felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I wasn't expecting this at all." That's it for this episode, guys. If you've watched to the end, then that may be an indication that you enjoy the episode, so please drop a like so the video could reach more people. See you in the next episode. Take care.